I am Janet Paskin from Bloomberg News.
Hi, I'm Rob Barnett with Bloomberg Intelligence, and I'll just quickly run down the panel here. We've got Jerome Foster, who is a social impact consultant and White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council member. Next to Jerome, we've got Jessyn Farrell, who's Director, Office of Sustainability and Environment for the City of Seattle. Then we've got Ben Eidelson. He's a General Partner at Stepchange. And last but not least, we've got Caroline Alden, who is co-founder and Chief Scientist of LongPath Technologies.
And we are here today to talk about growing your career in climate. What does it look like to be working in climate today? What might that be looking like 1 year, 5 years, 10 years from now? And how to navigate this really rapidly changing field as a professional. So I think one of the things, we have such a variety of experiences up here, which is what's going to make this really fun. So the way that this is going to work is we're going to ask some questions and hear about your stories and your paths and what you do now and what you thought you were going to do when you were 10 and how those things linked up. And then we'll have a little bit of a conversation up here, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So there's lots of opportunity to for you to have your questions answered about how all of this is going to go. So I think the best thing to do would be, Caroline, if we can start with you, and then we'll just come this way. If you could just sort of narrate what it is that you do now and how you got there.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I do now is something that didn't exist when I was growing up, and there was no thing to imagine like it. And so the first thing I'll say is that if you feel like you don't know where you should be going on your path, that's okay, because in retrospect, it all kind of hangs together, and it looks like a trajectory that makes sense, but when you're in the moment, it doesn't seem to. Anyway, so I started off, I went to college and studied geology because you could go outside and look at rocks, field trips, and then ended up going to grad school basically for that because I didn't quite know what else to do, and ended up looking at greenhouse gases in the atmosphere for my PhD. I was going to kind of do glacial geology, but then ended up, as the story goes, finding one opportunity, an invitation to go work on greenhouse gases instead, and I thought, I don't know, I might as well do that. That seems interesting, and kind of went down that pathway and ended up gaining a skill set, in my PhD that was pretty niche, and then, so it's kind of hard to find jobs if you're an atmospheric inverse scientist and modeler. So I just kind of kept going. I went and did a postdoc, and then ultimately I was just looking for opportunities to get back to Boulder, where my now husband is, and kind of saw a grant come across the listserv. They were looking for an inverse modeler, and I joined the project. So I was kind of still on that academic track, doing the soft money thing at a research institute in Boulder. And that was when the research grant that had brought me back to Boulder ended up being about methane monitoring in oil and gas fields. And so where my PhD and postdoc work had been greenhouse gas monitoring at a very large scale, so kind of looking at fingerprints in the atmosphere of surface sources and sinks on very, kind of Amazon basin scales. This project was looking at methane emissions at a very small scale, and I thought, well, that seems kind of cool and applicable. And sure enough, what the project was putting lasers out into the oil field. So I got to gather with the folks who ended up being my co-founders, 4 really brilliant folks who do create lasers and develop lasers that can see methane. So we got together, and the project ended up working so well, we co-founded LongPath Technologies in 2018. And so what we do is we put lasers in the oil field, and we catch methane leaks for oil and gas operators. And so the impact is felt every single day in our company, where these leaks that would have been going for months, maybe even a year, are found and fixed within 1.1 days on average with LongPath data. So the volume of methane that is not going to the atmosphere as a result of this work is phenomenal, and it feels really good. So to come from kind of a climate science background and be worrying about the climate problem but not knowing what my place was in it, to being able to be, actively working on a solution every day is really lucky. I just feel really lucky to have been able to find that path, but that's how I got to where I am. Yeah.
Amazing. I'm Ben Eidelson. My normal day in, day out is helping founders of climate tech startups, particularly kind of software-based climate tech startups, just figure it out, especially at the very beginning. Often when it's 1 to 2 or 3 founders and a pitch deck and an idea, and they're trying to figure out, are they telling their story correctly? Are they meeting the right investors? Are they going after the right customer segment? And quite opposite, actually. 3, 4, 5 years ago, if someone talked to me, they would not say that I'm working at all in climate. I was at Stripe working on fintech APIs. I was helping all kinds of businesses move money via the banking system via Stripe's APIs. And before that, I had a startup. And before that, I was at Google working on Google's messaging apps and Google Photos. And so I'm kind of a wave of, I'd say, recovering big tech folks looking at climate and saying, like, can I really just keep working on fintech APIs? Can I really keep working on Google's messaging strategy, or even can I really go work at OpenAI or Anthropic, which is exciting, but doesn't pull me the same way. The other thing that kind of happened alongside for me in my life is in 2018, had my first child with my wife, who's in the back corner, and she's bouncing our third. And I started a podcast kind of sharing my journey into climate called Climate Papa, where I talk a lot with other parents. Jessyn's been on there, and kind of their path into climate. Because I find that the motivation, like, obviously I want to get into the weeds of technically what we're doing. It's so interesting. I want to nerd out on methane detection and what any given founder is working on. But it's, I think, really important not to forget why we care about this problem. It's like fairly obvious, and everyone has their own reason. For some people, it's like, how it feels to be in the mountains. But for me, it's like directly my 3 kids and how I think about the world changing for them.
So thank you all for being here. This is the 5:30 panel, so I think we're going to try to be really exciting and peppy for you all. So I'm Jessyn Farrell. I run the Office of Sustainability for the City of Seattle. And if Ben is the recovering fintech person on the panel, I'm the recovering politician on the panel. And I sometimes say I might fall off the wagon, but we'll see. I also was literally that kid. I was voted most likely to be a politician in high school. So I wanted to be a politician when I was a child, and I grew up and became a politician. I served in the state legislature for 5 years. I ran for mayor and lost, and that is actually how I got this job. Mayor Farrell hired me to run the Office of Sustainability and Environment. But throughout my career, I have always really cared passionately about cities and how we make cities really great places for people to live. I grew up in this beautiful part of the world. How many people here traveled from other places, just out of curiosity? A lot of you did. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Growing up here, one of the really magical experiences that I had as a child was being in a small boat in the Strait of Juan de Fuca and being surrounded by orcas. And so the other thing I sometimes say is, like, I'm a Save the Whales environmentalist, like, really came to the climate work that I do now through just caring so deeply about this wonderful, beautiful city that we live in. And growing up at a time where there was a lot of sprawl happening, and just this realization that one of the ways we save our wild places is by making cities amazing places for people to live in. And so that led me to work on transit advocacy, because a lot of the amazing cities in the world have really great transit. And one of the things that is true about this part of the world is that in the 70s, the voters of Seattle voted down something called Forward Thrust, which was going to build a subway system in the city of Seattle. And so if you came from DC or Atlanta, you guys got that federal funding. We lost out, and so it really wasn't until the 90s and 2000s that we finally started to invest in transit, in mass transit, in light rail. And that's what I started my career doing. I ran a nonprofit called Transportation Choices Coalition, and we advocated for getting light rail built across the city, but also into the suburbs. There we go. And so as I was doing that work of advocacy, particularly in the state legislature, I was lobbying men who are my age, but like I think a lot of women, I felt like I needed to get credentialed and needed to get a lot of experience under my belt before I actually went into politics. And so it wasn't until I was, in my late 30s that I went into politics and ran for the legislature and got the privilege of doing really exciting things in the legislature, like advocating for additional transit, negotiating paid family leave in Washington State. We didn't have that, and I got to help negotiate that law. And then ran for mayor, and then ran for mayor again. And that's how I got actually both of my last two jobs. So maybe my job advice today is run for mayor, and if you lose, you might end up, everyone knows you're looking. So that might be how you get your job. So anyway, so now I get the wonderful privilege of getting to wake up every day and work with wonderful folks like Gus Williams, who's here in the audience from OSC, and work on how are we going to decarbonize our city as fast as we can and do it in a way that really focuses on environmental justice and frontline communities and folks who are really bearing the burden of climate change in Seattle. And so it's really a privilege to get to be here and get to do this work and talk about it with all of you today.
Yeah, I think going after that, I come from DC, so we got some of that.
So you got the light rail. You get to take that subway.
Yeah. I started out like very young and wanted to figure out how to get into the political organizing as well in DC. I took kind of the activism route, so I started out really being interested in like how is me as a young person trying to get involved in like policy decisions, how I can make a difference. And I started by like in middle school, I started organizing flyers, organizing events like that. But quickly in high school, I was like, why don't I use technology and like emerging tech to maybe use it as like another way to reach people? Because like politics, oftentimes people shut their ears off. They just kind of just like don't listen to you. So I was like, I feel like a more innovative approach is maybe to build virtuality environments and to show the impacts of climate change to people firsthand. So I ran a technology company for about 5 years called TalVR, and where we built virtuality environments all about like from Cater Alley in Louisiana to Kern County in California to all across the country about different experiences that frontline communities are facing, and just for people to relate to people outside of numbers in a way, because a lot of times when you talk about the data and statistics, people kind of dehumanize the realities of the situation. So a lot of my work was just working to rehumanize that. And a few years later, I was figuring out how I could support the movement in more robust ways. Because a lot of people didn't have VR headsets. I thought it was going to be the future back in like 2016 that everyone was going to have a VR headset, but it took a lot longer for it to adjust. So I got more involved in website development and supporting youth activist work there, and I helped with the climate strike movement in the U.S. with media and helping young people to get a green career within, like if they're a young person and they want to help out with like fundraising, volunteering, getting like support, not just in an informal way of going out and yelling on a Friday and making your voice heard, but making it an everyday action that you kind of commit to within your career. So you feel a sense of ownership in the fight for climate justice. Which felt really empowering. And ever since then, I have had that international connection of youth organizers who are now going into the career space. So being a Gen Z, when I was looking for a job, a lot of my criteria was like looking for an organization that really has those values within their organization for me to feel like I feel seen and heard in a way. And that was really important to me, and I think now going into to spaces and working with clients in my consulting work, that's so important when I talk about like youth and Gen Z engagement. But right after the climate strikes, I had got reached out to the Biden administration because I held a climate strike for 80 weeks in front of the White House. So I didn't think it was a good look for them to have a climate activist protesting right in front of the building. So they invited me into the meetings and to the spaces to give advice on like environmental justice and how we can include communities within climate policies. So I've been doing that for the past 3 years within the White House administration, working with CEQ. And yeah, it's been amazing. And now I work, as of this Monday, I started a role in American Forest, where I'm a tree equity ambassador, working in communities, especially in formerly redline communities, in communities of low income, to make sure they have equal and equitable access to tree cover and tree canopy. Really talking about those benefits and working with local municipalities to work on those things.
So, very interesting set of experiences, and I'm curious, especially given the diversity of sort of backgrounds that brought you all here. can any field be a climate field? And I was particularly thinking about you, Caroline. Like, you're working primarily with the oil and gas industry. How receptive are they when you're out talking to them? Can you do a career in climate but still have some tie into that industry? And it sounds like tech in your case, Ben. So I'm curious to kind of hear where climate jobs can exist and how open different sectors are.
Yeah, I mean, two things. I mean, one is that you can have any sort of expertise and probably find your way in the climate world. So this guy Pryor used to be a fracker in the oil fields, and he knows his way amazingly around oil and gas and is so skilled at that. And now he works for LongPath installing lasers in the oil fields. So he has a career in climate tech now, I would say, officially, you know. So like, your expertise can go, you don't have to be like a climate scientist or have a degree in whatever. And then, you know, the other thing I forgot the other thing I was going to say about that, but I'll come back around and let some others, Yeah,
I mean, I think absolutely. I think, you know, there are immense opportunities, you know, just looking at the tech industry as an example. Obviously, a lot of conversations around, you know, power usage and how it's going to spike with all the data centers. And so if you're at one of those companies, yes, I'm always excited for those people to choose to leave and go start the next climate tech startup, but also not an unreasonable thing to say, how do we optimize what's going on inside of these really impactful large organizations? I also think there's a really big missing opportunity for what I can call kind of a climate native product development. So where you look at what your company does and think about what that platform affords you uniquely. And so Stripe is one company that actually did do that. They rolled out Stripe Climate, which says any Stripe, you know, any business running on Stripe can flip a switch and we'll start pooling those funds together to purchase high quality, durable carbon removal and help get that industry going. I think it's quite a missing opportunity to look at, you know, Zillow or Redfin and say, okay, like how should these platforms be able to, you know, reach homeowners in cities and say, you know, let's help you finance, you know, the heat pump upgrade or the hot water, the hot water upgrade or whatever, you know, or solar. And so I think many companies do have that opportunity. So it's not necessarily the case that the first thing you should do is like leave your company and go to, you know, something that's explicitly climate tech. I think there's a lot of ways to kind of navigate all of that.
I remembered my second part, which is that finding profit motives for climate solutions is the other piece. So, you know, what's neat about my role is that we are finding a win-win. So, like, actually, oil and gas operators do have an incentive to reduce methane emissions because that's their product being lost into the atmosphere, and so that it's really nice to find ways where, like, the bottom line actually supports and I think I've heard so many incredible examples of that talking to folks around this conference where it's like finding the way to flip it on its head and be like, oh, actually it's profitable to go catch methane leaks. So I think that's another place to look for just corporate sort of leverage of climate solutions.
As a journalist, I have in my career been something of a generalist. So it's always really encouraging to me, just as a human being, to hear about people who took circuitous paths. At the same time, subject matter expertise can be really, really useful. And we know as organizations and companies have come to really value expertise in climate solutions and have started to build out their internal capacities, that we've also seen different kinds of credentialing programs pop up and different kinds of degrees and different kinds of, you know, various ways to signal that, like, you have some expertise or you are quite serious about this thing. When you look around at your industries, at your own path, at your peers, are there elements of credentialing that you feel are useful? Are there elements of credentialing that you feel are not at all useful? And how does that break down? And it's just an open question to the group. So whoever would like to, I don't know, Jessyn, you talked a little bit about feeling like you needed credentials at a certain point in your career. So maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, I think I'll answer that question by talking a little bit about Seattle's Building Emissions Performance Standard and how we actually got that done and how my office engaged in a way and that interplay of credentials versus not credentials. So building emissions performance standards, for those of you who aren't following the city's public policy making very closely, it's a regulation that we passed in December, the mayor signed into law, to basically require all of our large buildings, 4,000 buildings in Seattle, to get to net zero by 2050. So they have to decarbonize by 2050, and I won't get into the details. But one of the things that was really interesting in doing this, and the Office of Sustainability and Environment, we really try to orient our work around both decarbonizing, because that is really important, but also, as I said earlier, taking an environmental justice approach, which really means centering and listening deeply to people who are experts in their own lives. And so this kind of gets into the skill set of expertise. So on the one hand, our staff, some of our staff come from architectural backgrounds or engineering backgrounds, and that kind of expertise is really important. Other members of our staff have public health backgrounds. Other members of our staff have lived experience and have worked on environmental justice as frontline members of communities who really have an understanding of what it means to bear the burdens of climate pollution, of rising floods, of not having access to safe indoor space when there's a wildfire event. So one of the things that's been really special about the Office of Sustainability and Environment is that we actually have a real cross-sections of different kinds of expertise, ranging from lived experience to more formally credentialed, I'm an engineer and I'm a lead building expert, that kind of thing. And it is really that amalgamation of expertise, both kind of community-centric and then also, like how does a building work, that made being able to pass a really tough regulation like that possible and being able to listen. And I'm just going to add really quickly that how many people here actually have some experience in the arts, whether it's music, writing, or art, painting, sculpture? Raise your hand if you do. I'll say that one of the things that has really propelled my career throughout all of it is being trained as a jazz musician. And the reason that's so important is because one of the things you learn as a jazz musician is to listen, and then to take a risk and put something out there, and then to iterate and listen again. And in the public policy field, being able to listen and iterate and find kind of a creative solution that maybe is something brand new that wasn't there before is really, really important. So to that question of like experience and credentials, I really think that actually training in the arts is something that is so important to being able to be in this creative problem-solving mindset that is what we really, really need in the climate space.
I'm a bit of an anti-credentialist, I think, or I'll represent that viewpoint here. I think there's specific things, like if you need a PhD in methane gas detection to solve certain problems, but I could be wrong. I'm guessing you're pairing yourself around the team with a lot of people who are just generalist executors and operators.
I'm the only person with a climate background in a 50-person company.
And so if you're someone who's interested in that problem, you go find LongPath and go team up with them, right? And so that's I think that credentials can be used to slow down people's individual transition into this space, and that deeply concerns me as a potential effect, because what we need is as many people as possible running at it all as quickly as possible. Someone who I deeply respect in the space who started this organization called Spark Fund that's trying to find underinvested kind of solutions in climate that are kind of just not being looked at deeply enough, said to me, the amount of time it takes to get to the frontier of any particular thing in climate is kind of 3 months of deep conversations with people working on that, right? You can figure out if you're in this room and you're I really want to learn about cities and buildings and decarbonization. It's not that you can be the expert in the world on that, but you can build the network. You can go have conversations with people. You can read the couple books, and then you can start doing stuff that is productive, I believe, in the space. And so along the way, you'll find the relevant credentialed people who are excited that you're there at the table showing up and ready to go. And so my take is not, hey, pause what you're doing, go find the 4-year program. We don't have 4 years for you to wait to go work on the problem, in my take.
Can I follow up and just ask this idea of that is this a type of career path where you have to make financial sacrifice, or is it kind of a win-win where you can actually make good money and feel good about the work you're doing for humanity. So I think I know the answer, but I'm curious. Can you get paid well?
We're just a startup like any other startup, and we have investors like any other startup would have, and so it's not different. We're still fighting for software engineers with Google, just like every other startup is. But
The most successful companies and careers in the next 5 years will be in climate.
I don't want to put you on the spot, Jerome, but I feel like activism often is, or there is a perspective that is sort of at the least remunerative end of the spectrum. Where, can you talk to the group a little bit about, I suppose, the financial or economic prospects for somebody who really wants to be doing advocacy and working to push a policy agenda in a very grassroots way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think over the past few years, especially since 2019, we've seen a massive inflow of funding for a lot of grassroots organizations, and I think there's a article that came out a few days ago saying that a tree equity kind of initiative manager can be $60 an hour, overseeing the programs and working with communities. And from that, it kind of trickles down to well, if that person is from the community doing activism and they see that job posting, they're the most qualified person because they have the ground truthing, they know what the community needs, and they're able to go in and just build off of that network that's already there. I think that's what's really has changed a lot, is that activism in a way allows for a lot more people to be involved because of that funding that's now going in. I think we do need a lot more support so that activism shouldn't really be a lifelong thing that you do. It should be that politicians are responsive to our work so that then after 5 years they don't have to exist. And that they're doing their job, the agency are doing their job, and then we just go back to living our lives, doing our passions and things like that. But yeah, I think that if you want to kind of go nitty-gritty into the details of different industries and things like that, I think it is really important to have funding in that sense. Yeah, I think there's much more that's needed in a sense because I think especially with youth-led work, only 1% of climate funding goes to youth-led climate initiatives, and we're responsible for now. And I think before 2018, less than 10% of the human population knew about climate change, and now 87% of people not only know about climate change, but think we should do more about it. And that's because of young people rising up. Because we're at every space, we're in every room. We were saying that you're going to put climate as the #1 issue, and now climate is the #1 issue, and no one can ignore it. And I think we have to be responsible and responsive in a way, especially foundations and financial institutions, to say if you're looking at a company or a startup and you want to continue to be in the climate space, it can slip back into kind of people seeing it as an externality. And climate is all about making sure that we are seeing it as the core. Because if we're a business operating on planet Earth, we rely on a healthy environment to be able to have a sustainable business. So I think, yeah, funding is really essential.
Are you guys worried about a shifting political landscape in the U.S., maybe changing any of the momentum that's occurring in the space? Ben, I tend to agree with you that a lot of businesses are going to thrive in the climate space, independent of who the president is. But we are facing a big election, and so I'm curious if there's a general sense of maybe the momentum slows, if there's a change in politics at the national level.
I think we're deeply protected by the work that cities are doing and states. And so, there's been various administrations over the decades, yet California keeps driving up the car standards. And so, and so I think as long as California does what it needs to do, and Washington and our political infrastructure does what we need to do, there's a protective force. Now, certainly, the Inflation Reduction Act would not have happened in a second Trump term, and that is deeply exciting that we now have this capital flowing into all of these projects. So it does slow some things down, but I view it as a speed bump slow down because the effects of climate change are here and ramping up every year, right? And so then the activists are correctly louder and more active, and that then shifts the Overton window for the political landscape. And so, 3 years ago, politicians continually denied climate change. They no longer do, even on the right. They now attack climate solutions, which isn't great, but you're seeing this shift as a result of, it's no longer a thing you can deny. So that's my optimistic take.
I mean, I'll say politics matters tremendously. And in some ways, it's like the best of times in climate, and it's the worst of times. I came into this job 2 years ago when there was new city funding through the payroll expense tax being enacted and having a chunk of that funding being put into climate. There was new state funding through the Climate Commitment Act, and that was being put into all kinds of climate projects, and then, of course, the IRA. So having this kind of unified approach from the state, federal, and local government really matters, because this is an all-hands-on-deck crisis, right? And so, and we don't have a lot of time. We're really late to the game in terms of going big and scaling and getting heat pumps in every single home and getting people into electric cars, or even better, walking, biking, and taking transit, because we already know how to do that. You know, tree equity and all of the different policies and things that need to happen very quickly. And so I am just going to say politics does matter, elections do matter, get educated. I'm, you know, obviously a city official, so I'm not going to weigh in specifically, but I can say go do your homework, because it is a moment where, because of all this funding, I have a tremendous amount of optimism around our ability, at least as a city, to be able to do things like make sure that, like, we're all enjoying these beautiful blue skies, but it's quite possible in the next 4 to 6 weeks, these skies are going to be really orangey and gray, and it's going to be hard to go outside and breathe. And this is a city where people don't have air conditioning. There are not safe spaces for people to be inside. And so, you know, if we want to be able to tackle that problem and get heat pumps in every single residence in the next 5 or 6 years, we need that partnership from the federal government. We cannot do it alone. We need that partnership from the state government and the private sector. I mean, one of the exciting things about this moment is that there are these interesting creative partnerships that are happening between the public and private sector, and leveraging private capital and public investment. So I have a lot of trepidation, but the game is not over yet, and we need to play really hard over the next several months.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is the best way to say it. It's like, it's not really that political in a sense. It's like, if as long as we understand in ourselves the responsibility we have to inform ourselves about the political system it is and the weight that carries, then I feel like there is that sense of optimism in a way, because all of us know the urgency of the climate crisis. And when we go to November, I think maybe a lot of people aren't really talking about climate change the same way they used to, because like, we were really trying to preach and like get everyone to know about it, but now everyone knows about it. And they're like, we may not be making those YouTube videos, but silently we're seeing people may not be checking that out. But I think it's really important to kind of know that, like, if there is another 4 years of a person in a different federal agency, that private sector has already been motivated enough to know that they have a responsibility to take action no matter what the public sector is doing.
Yeah, I think there's a certain inevitability to it where, as emissions rise and as the impacts are felt and adaptation is required, and as technology continues to develop to understand emissions, see emissions, like know where they're coming from, and the adaptation technologies as well, I think there is going to be some inevitability to it, as well as international, for example, in the oil and gas markets, the EU just passed their own methane regulations, which place requirements on imports of, for example, U.S.-produced gas to be produced without as many methane leaks. So it maybe not fast enough, but I think there will continue to be progress regardless of, what happens with Chevron deference, what happened with Chevron deference and so forth.
You said working on the election, if you're like floating, you're like, I just want to work on something impactful in climate between now and November, like the election is going to be really impactful. So it's a thing to work on that is valuable as well.
We're going to take questions here in just a second, and we'll do that with a passed mic. So if you raise your hand or catch the eye of our organizer over here, that would be great. And as you start to formulate your questions and flag her, I want to ask quickly, when you get together with peers, right, and they say, we need a good person for blank, or, it's so hard to find a really great person to do this kind of job. Where are you and your peers seeing sort of holes in the job market, in the candidate pool? What do you in each of your fields wish that there were more of?
Well, we're hiring, so I can talk about that. Check out OSC's website. In part because of federal funding, we are hiring in our tree canopy equity work. We have a $12 million grant to improve tree canopy in under-invested neighborhoods. Trees are infrastructure, and just like a lot of infrastructure, there are neighborhoods that have done a lot better over the years than others, and it often scans with race and social justice and economic indicators. So we are also, I think, in the building space, in part because of federal and state and local funding across the country, there is a strong need for expertise, and we talked a little bit about this, credentialed or not, but really people who do know how buildings work and can provide technical assistance to the 4,000 building owners that we are now requiring to decarbonize by 2050. So I think the building space, there's a lot of competition and hiring both in the public sector and the private sector. So that's a space where we just see we're competing with King County, we're competing with the state, we're competing with private entities that also need that same expertise within their own building portfolios. Transportation electrification, being able to actually do the work of electrification, that's a space where we're very concerned as we're, the government passing these mandates and partnering with labor unions and other entities to make sure that we have a workforce to actually do electrification. So there are a lot of different places where we're seeing a huge need for people. And then again, just that, the basic skills around project management, around, like I said earlier, being able to listen and turn what you hear from community members into public policy that's supportive of people's needs. We see those needs as well and those skills. So check out our website, Office of Sustainability and Environment for the City of Seattle. Sign up for our blog, Green Space, and you will stay abreast of all of our job postings.
And what about in some of the other fields as well?
I think software engineers, folks who can code in Python and can also see the big picture and are curious about the data is always hard. I feel so privileged to work with my team of people who do that, and it's awesome. But hiring's hard. So yeah.
Yeah, I was going to call it basically the same thing. I think that at least in my circles, there's kind of two camps of people right now. There's people that are excited to go work on the new AI thing, and then there's people who are like, I got to go work on climate. And I just want more. I want to have more weight in more of those conversations. People just get activated. Like I presume most of this room is to say, yeah, that's exciting, but I got to go work on climate. And there's plenty of applications to the AI thing over in climate, but let's center that as almost this calling for more and more people that I think can help get you more engineers.
Yeah, climate prestige.
Yes.
Maybe you don't get paid as much, but we're on the climate problem.
Yeah, I think in my field, a lot of what I kind of see within a lot of the federal recommendations on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council is it has to be backed in data. And a lot of times we're missing the communities that are impacted first and foremost by climate change. It doesn't oftentimes have the air quality monitoring or the maternal health mortality for us to write that recommendation a lot of times. And I think that's been holding a lot of progress back because then if they want to create new policy, there's that scrutiny and it's it has to be much more robust, they would say, beyond just the non kind of research-based experiences. So I think more people who are doing that research, who are going into communities, who are making air quality monitoring more accessible and making it more portable and making it cheaper as well. And I think that would be really impactful within getting more climate policies really pushed out there. So that's.
Let me offer just a little bit too. I work at Bloomberg. Bloomberg Intelligence is the research division of the company, and we have about 400 analysts, and they think about everything from the energy sector through consumer goods. And typical career path would be maybe accounting, business, finance, economics, into sort of this skill where you apply technical know-how to think about the future of companies. And for a while, I think we had kind of had this approach where we said, hey, look, we've got financial analyst types, and then we've got ESG people, and they were kind of in two buckets, but increasingly, I would say we're viewing it from the lens that all businesses have, issues, not just climate, but sort of broader ESG bucket. And so we're kind of asking all analysts, independent of sort of what sector you cover, to have some thinking. And so I know for us, we're integrating, this sort of climate paradigm or ESG paradigm just across all sectors that we cover. And so I think that technical skills are sort of quite useful, and just and I don't think you can get away with sort of covering, say, the oil and gas industry, but not knowing what carbon emissions are today. It's just not going to work.
Great. We have a question over here. And for questions, just please start with your name and your organization.
Sure. My name's Mark Wilson. Question for Jessyn. So, I work in building retrofits. I congratulations on BEPS. It's really great policy, in my opinion. Kind of follows local law 97 in New York, and I live in Vancouver, so there's a building policy there. How are you guys administering it? Is it a carrot or a stick, and what are the penalties, I guess, for not reducing carbon emissions, or how are you handling that from the city? I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. So ultimately the goal is to actually get buildings to decarbonize as opposed to get funding for programs through fines, right? So at the end of the day, we really designed the program so that there is flexibility built in. We have a lot of support, both technical expertise for under-resourced buildings, in some cases funding, depending on, federal funding, et cetera. But there are fines if if compliance doesn't happen. The first compliance date isn't until 2031, so there's a really long lead time, and in between now and then, buildings are having to file decarbonization plans with us. So there's a number of things that we'll be doing to work with building owners to help understand how they are planning on meeting these net zero requirements. So it's very similar in some ways to these other laws that have passed. I think the one thing that we really iterated is we created 3 compliance pathways. So there's a standard compliance pathway your building fits into. You're able to hit all of the decarbonization targets that kind of ratchet up over time. There's a secondary pathway that has some tinkering around the edges, some ways that maybe you have some deductions around cook stoves in your building. There's some deviations, but they're not major. And then there's a pathway that you have significant deviations, but to be able to take that pathway, you need to file a very comprehensive decarbonization plan that really shows us how you're going to get there. So that's one of the ways we kind of changed a little bit, and that was in part response from building owners and how we're going to actually get people to decarbonize.
Does it depend on square footage of the buildings, or how do they?
Yes, so the penalties depend on square footage, and that's basically what they're based on. And the regulation overall is buildings that are 20,000 square feet and above.
And so by 2030, is it a percentage reduction around your carbon emissions, and that's the milestone?
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, everybody. My name is Eddie Mazuragos, and I'm from FutureGen. And so my question is relating to kind of the workforce mobility piece to the green economy. So I'm curious to know, what are some efforts that you guys are aware of that help not just on the technology talent side, but also on the skill side relating electricians, plumbers, HVAC technicians to hey, how do they get involved? How do they learn about the opportunity to just be active?
I can talk a little bit about that. So I mentioned Gus, who's in the audience. He runs our climate workforce programming for the Office of Sustainability and Environment. So one of the things that we are really cognizant of the fact that we need to invest in a climate workforce so that we are able to actually implement and have the folks who are able to do the things that we want to do around electrification, around decarbonization in buildings. So we partner with community colleges, we partner with labor unions, we partner with organizations that support people as they're going into apprenticeships, whether it's help with transportation or childcare. We also focus on how do we build not just kind of career pipelines for, things around HVAC and electrification, et cetera, but then also, we talked a little bit about tree equity. As we developed our tree equity program, we built in some workforce development in that sector. Being able to work in urban forestry is a climate career. So we built that into part of this federal grant that we just received. So there are different ways that we are very intentional around building in workforce supports that are related to the regulations or programming that we're putting forward. And then we also do a lot of work with, kind of capacity building nonprofits that are serving frontline communities. And that's also a workforce development. So how are we supporting people in nonprofits who are doing frontline environmental justice work and creating, space and capacity for folks to be able to grow their careers in that way too.
Yeah, I think from also speaking about the tree equity, since there are so many ways which workforce development really reaches people where they are, because a lot of times when they go into a climate career, they want to see the kind of impacts in their own community, their own neighborhood. And I think connecting people with like a nonprofit that is doing forestry or something that is kind of place-based is really important. Also, I think really connecting people to understand how their job could be intertwined with climate goals in a way already. Because a lot of people don't, as you're saying, a lot of people don't have to switch jobs to become a climate career. They have to be just more aware of the ways in which it intersects with climate targets and climate goals. And I think workforce development within that is having interns or having other programs for young people to feel involved in that process. So they know that there is a kind of platform where they're able to be ushered into that work. Because a lot of the times, like, sustainability work can be very high level, very technical, and it can feel like you have to really dive deep into one specific sector, where it's either research or science or tech or really just working on the ground. And if you're able to nurture that and having small programs where it may be like a 3-month intensive or like a boot camp style of kind of getting involved, I feel like that workforce development allows people to figure out what their interests are and what their passions are and how that couples with climate.
I think our societal response to this is like, we haven't really digested it yet, like, and to the prestige point, like, I don't think a few years ago, if someone said, hey, I want to build like the largest HVAC company in the in the Northwest, you'd be like, oh, that's so cool. Why do you want to do that? Like, I want to meet those people and talk to them and nerd out about how we're going to decarbonize, like upgrade. We have 160,000 single family homes just in Seattle, not the east side, not if you go south. Like, almost every one of those needs some upgrade, right? And we are, I mean, I don't know the exact, Gus probably knows like how far off we are in terms of having the labor force to accomplish that over the next 5 to 10 years, but we are very far off. And so there's this kind of dislocation that we haven't really digested around what that means from like a labor opportunity and an economic opportunity to go look at businesses that kind of felt ossified, right? Just these businesses that kind of grew somewhat linearly, somewhat, okay, that's just the HVAC shop you call when your thing's broken. It's like, no, we have to do this stuff much quicker than we've ever done before at a much bigger scale with much larger funding amounts. And so I just think that, folks that maybe have never thought about these businesses, there's like a new opportunity. And you're seeing some of that, private equity roll-ups on these things and various new ways of looking at it, but I just think it should change how we, like, the prestige around these kind of these fields quite a bit.
Yeah, I'll just briefly say, we obviously as a startup we well, may not be obvious, we actually like design the lasers, we build the lasers. So there's manufacturing folks, there are finance people who are dealing with all of the, like, how do you get stuff in the field and how do you deal with supply chain. There's marketing people, there are data analysts. So there's like so many different jobs in our company that are not traditionally climate jobs. And what we try to do is, to the best we can, we try to cascade messages through the company when we have this, like, every week we catch a leak, and it's always cool to get that confirmation from the operator to say, oh yeah, that was crazy, the XYZ thing broke, and no one would have ever known about it, but then it triggered this thing, and then there was a leak. And so we try to cascade that win through the company to say, holy cow, we just took whatever tens of thousands of cars off the road for 2 months. Try to put it in terms that people can really feel good about and be like, yeah, I'm a finance person, but I'm reducing carbon emissions. So, yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christy Drutman. I'm the CEO of Green Jobs Board. We're a company focused on bridging the gap for people to enter the climate space and climate jobs. So I really love this conversation. And a big part of the work I do is around diversity, equity, and inclusion in the climate space. And constant conversation that keeps coming up is around beyond pay transparency, because right now we require all of our companies to make sure that they're putting pay transparency on there. What are some other things that your companies or organizations are doing to reduce barriers of access within recruitment to bring in more Black, Indigenous, people of color, and more women into your organizations? And also, what are some of the ways you're internally trying to address the longer term career trajectory? Because a big issue for a lot of people, especially people of color wanting to enter this industry, is the lack of retention. There's a lot of drop off. There's a lot of microaggressions, things like that. So I'm just wondering how you all think that could shift. Obviously, salary transparency is one step, but what are some other ways you all are thinking about? I love you bringing up apprenticeships and thinking about childcare and transportation. What are some other ways you think we could reduce barriers to access? Thanks.
That's a great question. So we've been growing quite a bit over the last couple of years, especially as there's been a lot of funding. And one of the things that we've become a lot more strategic and intentional about is our recruitment. And so, tapping into national networks and local networks, really, almost, I don't want to say treating it like a campaign, but really being intentional and aggressive, honestly, around making sure that our job postings are seen and shared widely, and that's one of the first things that we can do, as opposed to just relying on, maybe the city of Seattle's typical job postings and where people go to find those. So we're doing a lot more partnering with, HBCUs in certain instances. We're working with all of our local partners who are, frontline community organizations, for example, to publicize. So just that really intentional and much more kind of aggressive and creative approach to recruitment is something that we've been doing a lot more of in the last couple of years. And then, the Office of Sustainability and Environment isn't perfect for sure, but we are definitely spending a lot more time thinking about how we onboard people, and then how we're working with people to, feel a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of, collegiality. Those are all things that are really important in retention, kind of across demographic groups, but particularly for, members of color of our office. And so we pay a lot of attention to that. And then when people leave too, and, kind of that offboarding, the exit process. And we're growing a lot as we do that. Again, I think that there are ways that we can continue to improve, but that over the last couple of years, that's a place where we've really grown and deliberately invested in, in how we're acting as an organization.
Yeah, I think another aspect and element is understanding within the recruitment process to understand. I know from American Forest perspective, for me joining, they really worked alongside me to carve out what the role could look like and understand well, if you're a young person also working in the space of climate and also working in the space of faith-based communities and Black communities, all of the different sectors I think you can kind of work on. And I think within that recruitment as well, within forestry, for example, partnering with a local nonprofit, which is doing that work already, or looking to do that work, is to reach out to them and say, hey, why don't we have a kind of joint position where you're still doing the work in the community, but then you're also working for the cause of the larger organization as well. I think that's something that's been really powerful. But also just being really receptive to different candidates when they're coming through the process, to know that we're not just looking for a kind of quick, just onboarding and then everything's happening, but to kind of have a support system from the larger organization, so that within the first week you're going to have a community where it's not just about the work, but it's about the life balance as well. Climate isn't just about the environment that you're in, but also the internal environment of what does the office look like? What are the employees thinking about outside of the direct tasks? And I think that's what's really important, is to make sure that in the job posting, throughout the entire recruitment process, that you're communicating how you're being holistic and how the job will be.
I would say that in climate tech venture, it's maybe marginally better than general tech venture, but not drastically. And I think we have a lot of the same issues that plague the general kind of historical venture tech, and a long way to go. It is I think there are more funds that are led by women and people of color in climate tech than in general tech, which is great. Unfortunately, mine is not one of them in my case. But for me, it's actually kind of goes back to what Jessyn says, which is actually kind of just broadening as wide as we can the funnel of access to us in our case, right? Because we're often helping give founders permission and saying, hey, you can start this company. We are happy to lend out our social capital to introduce you to other investors who will help get this going. And so just trying to kind of culturally be as available as we possibly can be. And I think other folks in climate venture really share that same attitude. It's just not this kind of zero-sum fight over, again, who the 3-person hot AI startup leaving Google is. It's much more collaborative. And so I think just trying to culturally represent that is the best thing our kind of small fund can do.
Yeah, and as a growth stage company, startup company, we don't have an HR person. We certainly don't have an HR department. Hiring is really hard. We don't have any money to recruit, or we don't spend money on recruiting. So it's definitely a huge challenge and something that we've tried to work through. So I appreciate the ideas from the stage, and that's definitely one of our goals as we grow, to try and, as soon as we are putting resources into that, to try to have that be a primary goal of the company. But for now, we just try to welcome everybody and put the jobs out on the Indeed boards or wherever the free boards are. Glad to be reminded of Green Jobs. That's a great job board. So it's a struggle for a growth stage company when you don't have the resources, but you try to make sure your job calls are looked at with that eye, to be inviting to everybody to just come and join the space.
Can I maybe ask just a quick maybe ending question? I know we're really close on time here, but we've got about 25 years to hit net zero based on kind of where the scientific consensus is at. Are you optimistic that we're going to hit it? And what's the most important thing you would say to people in this room to maintain momentum towards that goal? Just go down the line. We'll come here first.
Yeah, I think given the fact that there are so many people here today and have come this week to really talk about sustainability and then really hone in on solutions and implement them, I think I'm really optimistic about the people who are here and are doing that work. I think with respect to the fact that there is such a backlash from global politics that might slow things down, that's a bit of a concern. But I think that there is a critical mass of people that will, over the moral arc of justice, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would say, I think we'll get there. And I think if we just keep pushing, keep putting our heads in the sand and really working on these solutions, I think that over time we'll reach them.
Let's see. I guess I'd just say, well, I'm an optimist by nature, so that's kind of my default. So I guess that's good for this kind of work. But I think the challenge right now is that we just have to scale. We know what works. This isn't like this mystery anymore. We know what works. We know what works in the building sector, in the waste sector, in the transportation sector. We know what we need to do to adapt around sea level rise, around tree canopy. So we know what we need to do. And I think that's actually good news, because for so many years there was just this question of what is it that we should do about this? But we actually know what to do, and the answers are here. And so now the challenge is to just move as fast as we can and navigate the tension of scaling, which is at one timeline, and working with community members and working, to build trust, which is a really different timeline, and navigating that. And so, but to me, it's just not a mystery, and the answers are right in front of us, and it's just a matter of rolling up our sleeves and showing up every day, and again, doing our homework in advance of an election, but really just rolling up our sleeves and keeping at it, because we can do big things. We just passed a huge building policy in the city of Seattle, and that makes me really optimistic.
I agree with everything Jessyn said. I think that I'm a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist. I think the next couple of years are going to be, or the next 5 to 10 years are going to be bumpy, because we're going to get just more of the effects of climate change without yet having our solutions starting to hit yet, right? And so, but I think 25 years from now we'll be feeling pretty good. And I think the number one indicator for me in optimism is actually talent coming into the space. And so the main thing I would say is come in. If you're here, you're probably at least partially in. But if you're not all the way in, come all the way in, because that makes me feel better about 25 years from now.
Very well put. So somebody on the main stage yesterday, I think it was Adrian Grenier, said he invented a term called oscillate in terms of climate, where he zooms in and zooms out, and I think that that's important, and for all of us to, I'm typically very zoomed in because I have small children and a startup, so I'm usually just like methane policy. But then coming here and zooming out, it's so amazing and inspiring to hear all the stories and see what other people do and hear the current conversation on the climate crisis. And so I think that's important. Like, zoom out, get a lay of the land, and then zoom in and like auger in whatever your skill is. It doesn't matter what your skill is. Like, you have a place in this. If you auger in and keep following your path, it will end up where your values will lead you. And probably if you're here, it's going to be in climate tech or the climate space. So and I suppose to your point, about as the sort of impacts of climate change mount, I do think that frankly the last few years have been a little bit eye-opening in terms of how much more rapidly, for example, extreme weather events, which were pretty hard to predict in the earlier climate models, have been happening. And so while that's frightening, I do think we're going to, within 25 years, I think we're probably going to really changed our ways.
Thank you all so much for being here and for sharing all of your stories and your advice and your wisdom. Thank you all so much for joining us today, for your questions, for your participation, and I hope that you enjoy the events that are on tonight, and come back tomorrow, come back Saturday, have some of those inspiring interactions. Anything from you, Rob, to close?
Thanks for coming. Yeah. Enjoy your evening.
Okay. Thank you.